Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim, mostly because I finally get to say that you and I are taking a trip to hell together in this episode. We're going to visit many locations that claim to fall into the depths of hell. But before we do that, Tim, I'd like to fall into the depths of how you're doing today.
Go to hell, Lance.
Perfect. I'll see you there.
So our guest today is author Erika Engelhaupt, and she has written a new book that was released in the summer of 2024. It's called Go to Hell, A Traveler's Guide to Earth's Most Otherworldly Destinations. And we speak with Erika today in this episode. And this is the second time we've spoken with Erika. She wrote another book called Gory Details, and we spoke with her about that book just a couple years ago. Yeah, actually about exactly 2 years ago. That's episode 362, if you want to scroll back to that. And that was a great conversation too, a really fun book to discuss with Erika. And this one, Lance, is no different. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, so Erika takes us on a little bit of a journey all over the world, and she goes into the areas in which people claim that they have a pit of hell or there's a purgatory waiting room. We even get a little bit into the history of Halloween, Tim, which we've covered as well a couple of years ago.
Yes.
We covered the history of Halloween from the fields of Ireland. And along the way, we have some good laughs with Erika.
Okay, so check out Erika's book. You can get it at her site. That's erikaengelhaupt.com, or there are links to other sources in the show notes.
And a real quick announcement, folks. We are excited to let everyone know that on Friday, March 21st, we are going to be hitting YouTube twice. We're going to have 2 live shows on our Missing channel on YouTube Friday, March 21st. The first one is at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be talking about some weird crime stories, and it's going to be highly interactive, so we're looking forward to interacting with everybody who is in the chat during this live show, and then we're going to come back with a special Empty Frames live show, also on the Missing YouTube channel, so that's going to be live at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Special guest on this Empty Frames live show, someone who brings to the conversation a very unique perspective and a very interesting theory on who he thinks is responsible for the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. So this is Mr. Charles Pinning. We just had him on our latest Empty Frames episode, and he's going to be joining us live on our Missing YouTube channel, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we can't wait to interact with everybody on both of those live shows. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. Please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial, and we will be right back as we embark on our trip to hell with Erika Engelhaupt.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome back to the podcast, Erika Engelhaupt. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
We're doing so well. We were just talking about how much we were looking forward to this conversation, and I love hearing your name. Welcome back to the show, because the first time you were on, it was such a fun conversation. We talked about your book, The Gory Details, and that was such an amazing conversation and so educational. But before I go on, can you just introduce yourself to the audience and let them know who you are and a little bit about your past?
Yeah, sure. So again, my name's Erika Engelhaupt. I am now a freelance writer, and I'm a science journalist. I worked as an online science editor for National Geographic and continue working very closely with them. So I'm currently working on my 3rd book for National Geographic's books, which I'm very excited about. We talked about my first one, Gory Details, The Adventures from the Dark Side of Science. And so that gives you kind of a clue to some of the dark and creepy themes that I tend to like. So the book that we're going to talk about today is Go to Hell, which is a traveler's guide to Earth's most otherworldly destinations. And I think that kind of tells you a little bit about my brand.
It's amazing. And the first time I saw that title, I just laughed to myself. I'm like, that's so you. Like, that's such a perfect title. It's so direct and hilarious.
It is. And, we really debated on the title. Actually, the editors and the folks at Nat Geo loved the idea of the title being "Go to Hell" from the beginning. And I was actually the one at one point who was a little bit nervous about it. I was like, if people see this, sitting in bookstores or whatever, are they going to be turned off? Are they going to feel like they're being insulted or, be deeply offended by the "Go to Hell"? They came back and they were like, we ran this past all of the marketing people. We think people are going to really like it. And you know what? If you don't get the joke, then you're probably not the target audience anyway. So if you're that easily offended.
Yeah, if you're that easily offended, you're in the wrong section of the bookstore.
Yeah, probably so.
But also something I've learned from listening to your book, I listened to the audiobook version, is that humanity is completely obsessed with hell.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really what inspired me to write this book. I mean, people say, how would you come up with the idea of a travel book about hell and hellish places? And really the backstory goes back to working at Nat Geo, being interested already in dark and creepy stuff, and National Geographic being a place where, it's all about places and different cultures and different places around the world. And so when I started realizing how many places around the world were either called Hell's Gate or portals to hell, I started looking into that and realizing that so many cultures around the world and throughout human history have had some concept of a hell or an underworld in particular, that it really is a fantastic way to explore the world and learn about all of those different cultures and all of that rich history. Because surprisingly, one thing that ties a lot of us together is a concept of some hidden underworld, usually below ground or underwater, hidden somewhere deep and dark, where either it's linked to the afterlife or it's just linked to another realm, some kind of otherworldly realm that's mysterious and dark and where all kinds of strange things can happen.
Yes, and we will get into that. I just want to deviate real quick. Tim had mentioned that he listened to the audiobook. I did as well. Your book came out in August, so I listened to it right at the top of the spooky season. So
Perfect.
It's a really great listen. It has an accompanied PDF that has the illustrations as
good.
well. I just wanted to give a shout out to the narrator, Megan Tusing.
Isn't she fantastic? They let me review some auditions that had been done for narrators. Myself and my editor, everyone immediately said, Megan, she was the best. She sounds like you're talking to your witty, smart best friend who is giving you the inside scoop on something. And she just has a really great way with it.
Typically, I will listen to something on like 1.2 or 1.3, but I had to go to normal speed for her because I wanted to really make sure that I experienced exactly what she was going for. But the illustrations are the illustrations are great. That's very Dante's Inferno.
To me, I'm really glad to hear that there is that PDF that goes with the audiobook version, because I was a little nervous about that with an audiobook version, because this is a very visual book. I mean, it's a travel book with places and all of these amazing photographs. And so that's great. You don't have to miss out on anything.
Why do you think we as humans are so obsessed with hell?
I think it goes back to that thing of, the great unknown, especially like death and the afterlife. That's really the great unknown. I talk in the book about the ideas of heaven and hell. There are a lot of cultures that have some idea of a paradise. And not every other underworld, by the way, is even all of that scary. Some of them sound pretty nice. But in general, I think our ideas are much more vivid and our imaginations are triggered much more by the idea of hell than the idea of heaven. I mean, I think most people, if they had to choose where to go after they died, they would pick heaven. But when you look at art and literature and this like rich history of people imagining the underworld, There's just so much there. Maybe it says something about how much we want to punish bad people that we're so obsessed with hell. But I think that, it kind of comes back to a common problem that I think people have faced throughout human history. And this is just my personal theory here, right? But everyone throughout history has had to teach their kids to be good even when no one's looking, right? And so the idea of some kind of hell or place of punishment or place of judgment, I think has been a common theme throughout our, morality, basically. You tell kids, like, even if you don't get caught, even if no one sees you stealing that thing, someone knows, you will be judged in the end. And get your comeuppance. And when you look at like the Buddhist concepts of hell, some of the East Asian concepts of hell, they're very punitive. They're very serious about their afterlife and judgment, I think just as much as Christianity is. I think that it's something that is kind of universal, that we have this idea of a bad place and a place where you can be punished for being bad during your life. Whatever happens to you next, whether you're stuck there forever or reincarnated, whether you atone for those sins, whatever it is, we seem to really like that concept. As a species of humans, we seem to really like that idea.
Right. Yeah. God's making a list and he's checking it twice.
Absolutely.
Wait, God is Santa Claus?
Yeah, well, it's kind of the same thing. It's just the difference of positive or negative reinforcement, right?
Exactly. That's kind of my thing, is I think about like, what would you teach your kids, and how do you get them to stay in line, even if they think they can get away with something?
You had mentioned how the Buddhist religion, how they interpret hell, and Christianity. Can you give us, this is a sentence I never thought I'd say, can you give us a brief overview of different cultures and religions and how they differ, and maybe some of the more tame ones compared to some of the more extremely disturbingly violent ones? Yeah,
I think one way to look at that is to look at world history, right? To kind of go around the world. And so when we trace our modern, like the modern kind of Christian idea of hell, that kind of traces way back to ancient Egyptian times and to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Egyptians had a concept of a place called Duat, and you would go there after you died and you would be judged, essentially. And if your soul was heavier than a feather measured on a scale, heavier with sin than the feather measured on the scale, then this monstrous creature would basically just come and end you for all eternity.
The feather of what, though?
I don't think they were that specific, but, in the illustrations that you see, like the paintings and things like that, it doesn't look like a real big feather. So, you've got to be really good.
Yes, exactly. Not a lot of wiggle room there.
There's not tons of wiggle room. Yeah. So, so that was kind of an ancient Egyptian idea. And then you go back to the ancient Greeks, and originally the idea of Hades, which we often use that word interchangeably with hell. The idea of Hades originally was just this kind of like gloomy, shadowy place where everyone went when they died. It wasn't fiery or a place of judgment, but it also wasn't pleasant. It wasn't heaven by any means. And that idea kind of morphed over time. When you get into the Roman times and you see the writings, for example, of Virgil, you start to see descriptions of Hades that get a little bit more spicy, right? So you get the idea of Tartarus, which is this kind of lowest level of hell where the really bad people go. And you start to see the emergence of this idea of judgment more. Okay, now we're going to move a little further in time to kind of closer to the time of Christ, a couple thousand years ago, right? By that time, you're seeing a lot of different cultures around the world, some kind of idea of a hell, an afterlife, an underworld. You've got the ancient Norse. They had Niflheim. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they had this goddess Hel, Hel. That's thought to be one of the derivations of the word that we use now in English, hell, Hell. And this was a goddess of an underworld. But then even in other parts of the world, I mean, you come over to the New World and you've got the Aztec and the Inca. They had really frightening hells. The Aztec had a hell called Mictlan. It had a lot of similarities even to that kind of Greek idea of Hades, where you had what they call a psychopomp, which is basically like a ferryman who takes you when you die to the underworld. So the Greeks had Charon as their ferryman, and the Aztecs had another guide to their hell, Mictlan, called Xolotl. You know, it's kind of amazing when you start to see some of the similar ideas popping up in cultures around the world that weren't even necessarily in communication with each other, but still came up with these similar ideas of like what happens when you die, and that there's this ferryman that takes you to this other place. The Inca had also a very frightening hell that involved like rivers of blood, and it was almost like you were running this horrible, frightening obstacle course after your death in order to try to like save your spirit or soul. And the Maya had something similar. They had Xibalba with 9 levels of hell. And then when you get over to Asian cultures, like I said, you had kind of a blending, like there was an ancient idea of a place called Naraka that became part of Buddhist and Hindu culture. Those Buddhist and Hindu ideas kind of merged in China with Taoist and traditional folkloric religions in China. And you ended up with a Chinese version of hell called Diyu. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it the way a Chinese person would approve of, but you ended up with this Chinese version of hell that also has multiple levels of hell and involves punishments that are specific to your sins. So that if you commit certain sins, you have certain punishments. And sometimes there are as many as 18 levels of that hell. Again, some of those common themes that you see, even in these really disparate religions and cultures around the world, you tend to see the idea of sometimes a ferryman that takes people across into the other realm, and different levels that represent either different kinds of sins that people have committed or different just kind of levels of how bad you're considered to be once you get there.
How does that happen, in your opinion, the communication between all of these cultures? There had to have been something that was inspired by another culture from, 100 years before or something. Is it travelers? Is it a combination of people just being curious and seeing illustrations on walls and things? Because it is so similar.
It is. And in some cases, we can actually trace where these ideas kind of followed people as they traveled. For example, the explorers who started off in the Pacific and ended up in New Zealand. So New Zealand wasn't settled by humans until relatively recently, but the people moved like from the Philippines through Pacific Islands, and you can see that they all have kind of a similar idea, for example, of there being a particular place on the island, often at the northwest tip of the island, for whichever reason. When you die, your spirit goes to that particular location, leaps off into the water, and then that goes into their version of the underworld, which is not a scary, bad underworld. It's more of a spiritual place where you meet your ancestors and things like that. So it's a much nicer underworld. But you actually see that concept, among different cultures as they moved from island to island over hundreds, or even thousands of years. In some cases, we know, like, okay, people moved and they carried some ideas with them. And certainly the people in the New World came from somewhere, right? Like we think we have some idea of how people came across in various ways and traveled along the west coast of what's now the United States and Central America and into South America. So probably there's some combination of people bringing those ideas with them from the cradle of civilization, basically, as people spread across the world. I just think that people have also faced some, common issues. Like I said, I think when people start to think about what an underworld or an afterlife might be like, they tend to look to similar kinds of places that look like they would inspire what, so you tend to look to deep bodies of water. You tend to look for underground caves, volcanoes. These are natural features that I think have also inspired a lot of cultures in similar ways. So you tend to see a lot of caves and lava and fire and, a lot of those kinds of features pop up over and over again across cultures.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
How much travel did you do in order to write this book?
I got to do a good amount of travel. I couldn't, of course, afford to go to every single place in the book.
Really?
Well, that would be a lot. I tried to focus on places where I could go and see, as far as international travel, I tried to go to places where I could see more than one thing, more than one place. So I traveled around Ireland, which has amazing. We should talk more about that because there's just such a rich history in Ireland of their ancient legends and right up until the modern day and what we now celebrate as Halloween. So I went to Ireland, traveled all around. I went to Naples, Italy, and traveled all around that area, which also has that wonderful history. Dante's Inferno, all of that stuff comes from that region. And I also went to New Zealand, which just has the most spectacular, if you want beautiful hellscapes, New Zealand is a great place to go because the South Island has more of the mountainous, like what you think of the Lord of the Rings kind of vibe. The North Island has all this volcanic activity and just really incredible volcanically derived landscapes, including places like a town that I went to called Rotorua, where it's just a regular, nice town, city, but there's just like steaming fumaroles and all this like boiling mud and pits and things like that right in the town. And folks just live, side by side with that kind of scenery and volcanic activity and what most of us would consider pretty hellish features.
Talk a little bit about the Ireland experience.
Yeah. Oh, I love Ireland. Not only is it such a great place to visit for just the scenery, the atmosphere, the people, all of it, the music. But it turns out that there's this whole really cool history of what Christianity considered basically pagan religions. And so they have this rich history of legends and lore from pre-Christian times. And so one of my favorite places that I went was actually considered the birthplace of today's Halloween. And it's a little cave in County Roscommon, Ireland called Onagat. And I had to practice that quite a bit because it is not spelled like it sounds. Those Irish words are tough. So there's this cave called Onagat. That place was very significant to the Irish for a very long time. The reason is you would go into this cave and it was considered to be kind of a portal to their version of the other world, of the underworld, which was called the other world. And their other world, again, was not a scary, hellish kind of underworld, but it was rather a realm of spirits and gods and goddesses and very powerful supernatural beings. At a particular time of year called Samhain, which is spelled like Samhain, if you are trying to Google it.
Yep. It was a life-altering moment when we learned that.
Yes.
It's Samhain. And it looks like Samhain.
Samhain.
Yep.
That's basically a time when you're going from fall to winter. So their idea was that when winter arrives, basically through this cave, the barrier between our world and the other world would open up, and all of these spiritual and supernatural beings would pour forth at that time and go across the land and basically bring in the beginning of winter. So some of these were scary supernatural beings, right? That's where we get the idea ultimately of Halloween. Samhain was at the end of October, and it ended up becoming what we now celebrate as Halloween when, St. Patrick came to Ireland and began to spread Christianity in Ireland. At that time, all of those pagan practices were reinterpreted. They had a hard time getting the Irish to accept Christianity at first, even though it's now considered a very Christian country. It was hard to get the pagans to accept Christianity. And so what they ended up having to do was kind of rework a lot of the legends and practices that they already had and incorporate them more into a Christian framework. And so Samhain, which was, beginning of winter, you would have kind of a festival before it, so forth. That became reinterpreted as Halloween, and the spirits coming out of the cave of Onagot became demons and, witches and the more Christian ideas. So now when you go there today, I actually went there for Halloween and was in Ireland for Halloween. It was fantastic because I could go to celebrations where they were having parades and things like that incorporated both the legends from Samhain, which has its own characters. Like there's this really cool goddess, the Morrigan, that can shapeshift into a crow. And so you see a lot of references to those ancient traditions as well as the modern Halloween.
Apparently you just scared me because I just dropped my notebook, the pen's on the floor, the camera was shaking everywhere.
Sorry.
I was so into the story I didn't realize that my hands were on my notebook and it created this catapult effect of everything. So hold on one sec while I pick everything up.
So what was your favorite place to visit?
It's really hard because I loved the scenery. Everything I saw in New Zealand was fantastic. Ireland, I had a blast and loved all of the history. But I have to say there's a special place in my heart for Naples, Italy. And one of my personal favorites that I went to and that I think your listeners might appreciate because it was one of the creepiest places I went was a Catholic church in Naples known as the Purgatorio ad Arco. This was built in the 1600s and it was dedicated specifically to praying for souls in purgatory. Purgatory was considered, that's actually like really a pretty bad place. You die, you go there, you're atoning for your sins, and if you don't atone for your sins, you can't move on to heaven. So the congregation of this church was specifically dedicated to praying for those souls so that they would get out of purgatory, which I think is very nice, actually. But when you go in, the church looks so creepy. I mean, everywhere there are skulls, there are images of souls burning in purgatory, all of this artwork and so forth. And what ended up happening was that they started a practice there of actually adopting particular skulls and bones. So the church has a burial ground at the bottom, like an underground tomb. And they got a lot of plague victims, things like that. People who were poor, people who, died of plague, things like that, didn't have another place basically to put these bodies. So they were buried in this church or, put in tombs in this church. And the congregation would basically pick particular remains to pray for. They became known as the Neapolitan skull cult or the cult of the dead because of this veneration or obsession with the skulls and the bones, right? The human remains. And eventually the Catholic Church dissuaded them from doing this. But for the people who were doing it, I think they legitimately felt like this wasn't about the veneration of human remains. It was really, they felt like they were doing a good thing. They felt like they were praying for these souls and helping them move on to heaven. In return, sometimes they would ask for favors and guidance from those spirits. Like, for example, there's a particular skull there that's still there, and it's kind of decorated with a veil and so forth, and it's considered kind of a patron of young brides. And the legend is that this was a young bride who died and was buried there and was prayed for. Her skull is known as Princess Lucia. She's still there as a patron saint to young brides. So when you go to the church, you can tour the entire church, and you can also go down into the basement, into that underground tomb area, and see some of the remains that are still there. Some of them have been moved to another cemetery where the same kind of practices went on. but you can still go and see some of those remains that are still there. I found it very touching. I thought it was really fascinating and really kind of a beautiful kind of practice. The idea of this whole church being dedicated to souls in purgatory, I thought was really cool. My friend who went with me just thought it was the creepiest thing ever. And she's Catholic, and she was like, wow, this is really out there. She was ready to get out of the tomb as soon as possible. But for me, I just thought this is so eerily fascinating, and it's so cool to see how, people have always had morbid curiosity and a fascination with, death and the afterlife and all of these things. To me, it was just really cool history to see all of that. So that was one of my favorite places. And it's just this, little church right in the middle of Naples, right, with all of the winding streets and so forth. So you can go there and then you can go get some amazing pizza. So to me, that's like a really fun vacation day.
Yeah, it's a good trade-off. Spend some time in this tomb, but don't worry, there's some good thin crust.
Yes, absolutely. There's some good Neapolitan style pizza when you're done.
You said that there would be favors that were involved with this. Are the favors something that people would sort of collect and that would ensure their non-delivery to hell? Like, the more I do, the less chance I'm going to go to hell? I
think that it was more like asking, give me strength and guidance for this or that. I'm dealing with this horrible husband. Princess Lucia, can you help me? And one thing that I did hear was people would ask for inspiration for their lottery numbers. Like that was that was a pretty popular request as well. Give me inspiration. I need to hit the lotto.
Jeez.
Wow, amazing. Some things never change.
Some things never change. I mean, we're human, right?
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Can you tell us about the Well of Hell in Yemen? I thought that was one of the most interesting spots.
Yeah, that's a really spectacular one, and I have not been there. That's another one where you kind of have to go out to the middle of a desert in the middle of nowhere. So the Darvaza crater, Great Gates of Hell, is like that in Turkmenistan. And then in Yemen, yeah, you've got this basically a big sinkhole, but really super deep. And there were all these legends about it for many, many years. The idea that there were jinn, which are, kind of in Islam, their version of these spirits, supernatural beings. Those would be in the well of hell and that they would come out. There was the idea that if you got too close to it, you would be sucked in to your doom, of course, and that, birds flying over it would be sucked in, things like that. So there were a lot of legends about it for many years. And so it wasn't until very recently that actually a team from Oman, I believe it was, went and explored and actually was lowered, had people get lowered all the way down to the bottom of it, to see it. And it was actually quite beautiful from the bottom, because you've got, some water kind of dripping down. So it's almost like a little trickle waterfall coming down. And there were some animals that are able to survive down there and so forth. But it is kind of dark and scary unless you're there when the sun's like right overhead. So yeah, that one I think is not one of those places that very many people are going to be able to explore, but it's one of those places that's so cool to know about and see the photos of and see the exploration of. Now, the Gates of Hell, you can actually go to and see, and that is in Turkmenistan. There's this, again, you have to travel to the middle of this desert, but it's doable. And there are actually guided tours that will take you in Jeeps out there to spend the night, because you really want to see this at night. It's a giant flaming hole in the ground. It really looks like, I think the way I described it was as if the ceiling of hell has caved in and you're looking down into it from above. Probably what happened was that there was natural gas seep there, and then during some natural gas exploration decades ago, that was being explored and accidentally ignited. And so you ended up with this huge supply of natural gas that just keeps seeping out of this hole. and feeding the flames. So you end up with this gigantic crater that is just on fire perpetually for decades. I love it. When you see photos of it, it's really amazing. And so the idea is you can go there and basically camp out. So you can do like a tour of the Silk Road and that whole region, which has great history and culture. And you can, spend a night gazing into the gates of hell.
Into the fiery hole of hell.
Which I think sounds like a great trip. I haven't been able to do it yet. It was very difficult to go there until, for several years. I mean, through COVID, everything was shut down. And then the president of the country actually was trying to figure out if scientists could just extinguish it. Like he wasn't thrilled about this becoming a tourist attraction. So they actually were trying to figure out if they could extinguish it and just cover it over, but it turns out you really can't. It's not something you can just like throw some dirt on it.
Or some baking powder.
It seems like they've kind of come back around and are allowing tourism again.
This is a somewhat of a weird question. I didn't hear this covered in your book. Does anyone travel to these places to end their life? Like, are they ever inspired to visit hell?
That's an interesting question. I didn't really hear about that, but I do think that some of these are important spiritual sites for a lot of people. So for example, in New Zealand, I visited Cape Ringa, which fits that bill that I was describing of in New Zealand, the Maori people have a concept of this afterlife. Your spirit goes to the northwest tip of the island and leaps off into the sea at this particular place. And that's how you join your ancestors into the afterlife. It's a really beautiful spot called Cape Ringa. So that's considered a very special and sacred place for the Maori. Likewise, I actually went to an actual pilgrimage site for Catholics in Ireland called St. Patrick's Purgatory. And like I mentioned about St. Patrick, St. Patrick had a hard time convincing the Irish in the early days to accept Christianity. And so the legend about St. Patrick's Purgatory is that he went to this particular place, which is on an island in a big lake on the west coast of Ireland. And he prayed, and Jesus came to him and said, what you need to do to convince these people to accept Christianity is to show them the horrors of purgatory and what will happen to them if they don't. And so there's a hole in the earth here, and if you go into it, you will get a glimpse of purgatory, essentially like, the fires of hell. The legend is that St. Patrick did this, and there was an actual pit in the ground on this island. So they ended up building a whole monastery around it and on this island. People for 1,000 years, people have been coming literally to this place for hundreds and hundreds for I think about 1,000 years. In the early days, it was a pilgrimage where you would go there and you would essentially get locked into this pit overnight, and people reported all sorts of visions of purgatory and demons and had all of these experiences. So it became very, very legendary. And over time, they got away from the literal gate to purgatory concept. But it is still a pilgrimage site. They've covered over the pit. They've turned it into an area where pilgrims come and do the Stations of the Cross. You can fast for several days and do these prayers. People are on their knees on this kind of rocky ground. So it's really arduous pilgrimage to make, but people come from all over the world. Catholics come from all over the world to do this pilgrimage at St. Patrick's Purgatory. And it all goes back to that original founding and the idea that there was a literal gate to purgatory there.
You were talking about the apprehension of using the word hell in your book, but there's a town that's called Hell, and they didn't seem to have a problem with naming their town Hell. Can you tell us a little bit about the town Hell?
Yeah, they were, total on the lighter side. The town of Hell, Michigan is so much fun. It's just this tiny, it's not even technically a town. It's kind of like this little unincorporated area, but it's been called Hell for a very long time. It goes back to when Michigan became a state in 1837. They had a landowner called George Reeves. The most popular local legend is that the town got its name when George Reeves was asked, okay, we're becoming a state. We need to name all of these areas and towns. What do you want to call this large tract of land that you own? And he supposedly said, you can call it hell for all I care. And so they did. And it's been called hell ever since. There were some efforts to change the name some years ago, but the residents of hell protested and said, no, this is our thing. We're keeping it. So they do have a post office there. You can send letters or anything really that you want from hell. Apparently it's popular to send your divorce papers singed
Yeah,
from
I thought
hell.
that was funny.
On the flip side, you can get married in hell. They have a wedding chapel, and I actually watched a wedding. It was actually a fake wedding. They were not officially getting married, but they wanted to have the whole ceremony. And so they had a blast with it, and all their friends, everyone wearing either devil horns or angel halos. So you can get married there. And it's just kind of a fun, family-friendly, small-town experience. There's one guy who owns a lot of the properties there. He's just a really nice guy who comes up with all of the hell-themed puns. And so they've got the putt-putt course is called Screams, and they've got all of these different festivals and little things that they do. I went in the summer when they had the Hello Fest. Of course, around Halloween, they do a lot of events, things like that. It's just a fun little place. You can stop off. You know, it's in that kind of like a lakes region of Michigan. So it's popular with motorcyclists. It's popular for just family vacations. You can go hang out by the lake with a cooler, and you can also just stop by hell. They've got all the hell themed merch you could ever want. You can get your t-shirt that says I've been to hell and back. You can be mayor of hell for a day.
That's what I wanted you to mention, that you can be mayor of hell for a day.
You can be mayor of hell for a day. You can buy a square inch of hell. They really play it up. They love it. It's infectious. I mean, it's cheesy. Yes, absolutely. It's touristy. Sure. But is it a hell of a good time? I'd say yes. You know?
Well played.
And it's actually hell, but it's not hellish.
Absolutely not so hellish. Another thing you can do is go in the winter when hell freezes over. And, you know, you got to get a picture with the sign with icicles, you know, hell frozen over.
That's amazing.
So it's fun.
Can you tell us about Cape York?
Oh, yeah, in Australia. That's a legit scary place. I had to include that place because when you think about the monsters of hell, Cape York would be kind of the closest to that. This is a place, a spot on the coast in Australia where you've got tons of the saltwater crocodiles. Okay, if I'm scared, I'm really not very squeamish or scared of most things in nature, right? Like I can deal with spiders and bugs and all of that stuff. But I have literally for decades, I have had nightmares about crocodiles. Even I lived in New Orleans for a long time. I'm not afraid of alligators, but I am afraid of saltwater crocodiles. They're terrifying. If anything is a monster on Earth, it is a crocodile. Anyway, they just have every kind of venomous snake, crocodiles, giant spiders, just any creature that can kill you. I might be inclined to.
Any creature that has, like, is a popular phobia.
Yes. Anything that is a popular phobia that, you know, that you're probably afraid of, it's there. And so why would you go? But people do. It's one of those adventure destinations that people love to go, and even like camp on the beach, things like that. Be careful about that. Those crocodiles are for real, and that's where tourists do get eaten.
Have you ever watched a video of a crocodile swimming at full speed?
Yes. Why do you think I have the nightmares? Yes.
It leaves a wake like a boat.
Yes. It is horrific, and they're enormous. I mean, like a 30-foot long dinosaur coming at you, leaving a wake like a boat. I mean, that's just horrific. But you can... If that hasn't terrified you enough and you're like, oh, I've got to see this for myself, you can do adventure trips. You can go by Jeep basically, because you have to go through jungly areas and go to Cape York in that area. And it is amazing wildlife watching, and it is beautiful scenery, but everything there is ready to kill you.
Awesome. Well, if there's anybody I would choose to go to hell with, it's without a doubt you. So thank you.
I appreciate it. I'd be happy. I think that National Geographic should be doing guided hell expeditions, and they should have me as tour guide, and I will take people to all of the most hellish places in the world. I think that would be a great trip.
I think there's a market for it, so I think you're right. Do you have another book planned?
Yeah, so I'm working on a couple things right now. One is my next full-length book, and that one is going to be a little less morbid, although still, I guess, some death-defying in it. And that is tentatively titled Superpowered: The Science of Real-World Superpowers. So I'm looking into the science behind the limits of various human abilities, mental, physical, mind-body connection. So I'm having a lot of fun working on that, and meeting amazing people with amazing abilities makes me feel so average. And then the other thing I'm working on right now actually is another pretty Crawlspace appropriate topic. I am redoing what was a National Geographic bookazine. These are the magazine style books that you see on the newsstand. They have the yellow border, and they're on some single topic. Cats, Jesus, whatever. This one is called Secrets of the Supernatural, and I'm basically doing a whole new version of this. It's going to have history, culture, science's tangled relationship with trying to explain the supernatural. That's something that I'm always fascinated by. So there will be magic, there will be witches, there will be ghosts, there will be vampires, there will be all of it in this bookazine. So that should come out for next Halloween. So that'll be a good one to look forward to.
Amazing. Yeah, so we have at least 2 more episodes with you in the,
there you go.
In the near future. Can't wait.
There you go.
These are the best conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Erika, for joining us here today. We really appreciate your time and your journey into the depths of hell and back.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I hope people enjoy the book.